How do you change culture inside a company? More so, if you're brought in as a new executive, how do you make that culture be something that is going to transform the company, which is the reason your board brought you on in the first place? We've all heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So today, we've got Dr. Jeff Kaplan here to talk about how to change the culture inside your company. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you, Raj. Great to be here.
These are pretty big issues because if you're an executive, you've been brought in as a change agent for a company or an organization, and you know that culture is going to be part of the things that you change. I think by nature of you coming in, there's going to be some change. But what are some of the things that new executives encounter the moment they enter a company and they need to figure out what the culture is, and then how do they figure out what they need to do to get where they want to be?
Yeah, what they face is a brick wall.
Brick wall.
A
Yeah.
brick wall. So, because here's what happens, right? So, let's say it's the CEO, right? So the board brings them in, and the board brings this person in because it's what they need, right? They need a change. They need, maybe there's a lot of turnover. Maybe they're losing market share, right? So there's a lot of pressure, and the person before them has not done that, right? So they failed. So they had these conversations with the board, who's, by the way, not involved in the operations, ideally, right? And so they're coming in, they get excited with their big cape, ready to help, start a new day. And where they fail is they fail to adapt to first you have to align with the culture and then change the culture. So meaning, um, you don't come in guns a blazing, because what will happen is you probably end up losing good people. And then what you get is the scraps left over, right? And so the first thing to do is to fully understand it. So what you need to start doing is interviewing folks, not just your team and not just your team's team, but really looking at start talking to the person who, mops the floors, the person who answers the phones, like where the culture lives. It lives on the walls, right? So talk to the walls, talk to the people that are, you know, painting the walls, right? As well as everybody else. And then look for the symbols, and then I'll turn this back over, but look for the symbols. What are the symbols? Because a lot of what you experience when you first come in is it's not what you were told it was. And so you need to really spend, that first 90 days really getting to understand what you're walking into.
When you say start talking to people, obviously a great step one, is there some sort of rubric or way of measuring what you're seeing in terms of culture? Because culture feels like it's a warm and fuzzy thing that it's hard to quantify. Is there any kind of way to actually measure what you're seeing so that you can understand what to do to change it?
Yeah, there's actually some really good culture surveys out there. Now that assumes that you get an unbiased, good number of responses, right? Meaning it's not just skewed for the angry folks. In fact, a good friend and colleague of mine, Anna McKee, we were talking recently. She also has a new cultural survey out there so there's that's right. That's one thing you can do. There's certainly engagement surveys. You can look at, past engagement, scores, things like that. I like, if let's say your health system, I like, patient satisfaction scores or customer satisfaction scores, right? Because they're going to be a little bit maybe more objective. But you still want to start asking questions like, what do you love about working here? If you could have one wish, what would it be? If you looked at over the last couple years, the three things that have really either kind of annoy you like a thorn in your side, or get in the way from you being both happy at work or inefficient at work, what would they be, right? One of the things I really like, kind of the whole small step Kaizen way idea, is rather than necessarily coming in and making huge changes, really empower the people, even at the lowest levels of the organization who are closest to the issues, and empowering them to make little changes, right? And then that kind of creates momentum, right? And before you know it, you're starting to shift.
I feel that same way where you have to talk to people who are on the front line, the ones that are dealing with your customers, your patients, your clients. Those are the ones that have all the insights, all the information that you really need to know as an executive. And they're just never asked, because I think somewhere between that layer and the layers that come up before they get to you, stuff gets either lost in translation or changed in translation. So the information that you get is either distorted or inaccurate or is self-serving to someone who reports to you. And so how do you start fishing out those types of things inside the culture that may be the obstacles, because some of those layers, some of those middle management, maybe even upper management layers, could be potential sources of I guess let's call them culture change opportunities.
Yeah, well, first of all, yeah, how many times have you heard the folks on the ground floor saying like they don't know what they're talking about, or
Mm.
they have no idea what actually is happening?
It sounds stereotypical, but it happens all the time.
It happens all the time, right? And so, the word that just popped in my head as you were asking that question is communication, communication, communication. One of the biggest problems with communication, what you just said, is the further away from, the customer in a sense, or the product, the further away you are from actually understanding what's really happening. But the second thing is psychological safety. Is really, have you created, this kind of will lead to maybe cultural change too, right? Have you created an environment where people feel safe and comfortable, not just to say the truth, right? Like, because people are nervous, right? New person comes in, like people, try to test them out, but also to make mistakes, right? To try different things, to try to be innovative, right? We need to be innovative, right? Or do people get sort of punished? I was working with this leader one time who, when he became CEO, we worked together for a year, and he was trying to change it. He said he himself was still scarred from when he was at lower levels of the organization, and it was almost like a running joke about when he did this thing that didn't work out well, and so he was like the bunt of a joke. And he said that's our culture, right? It was very top down. Do this because I said so. Don't disagree, and don't try new things, because if you fail, we're going to make fun of you for the rest of the time you're here.
I really appreciate the list of questions that you shared about what executives can ask to try to understand the culture. So, what's the next step in the process? Because usually, this changing a culture doesn't happen in a vacuum. What are some of the best practices in moving this agenda forward?
Well, one is, so you bring outside folks, right? So one of the things I do value when companies, I was just talking to a company recently who we were helping them with selection. When you have a finalist for a senior role and you do some assessments and look for the best fit. And they said they really like to promote from within, right? So that way all that knowledge transfer,
Hmm.
carries over and they understand the culture, right? So that they don't make that mistake. But the problem that they can mistake is they're blindsided, right? There's an organization that I know that we worked with the whole senior team, and then new CEO comes in who brought literally five of their most senior folks from their old place, and they clearly have blinders on, right? What worked there does not work here, right? And so
Yeah.
they're running into it. So anyway, so you
Yeah.
get an outside perspective. That could be like new hires, which is fine, but it's also someone like an executive coach or a consultant, or even like a large consulting firm that can go in and start doing some analysis. But what I would say, like one of the things that we often do, we just did recently, is the organizational analysis, where an outside person can build trust, right? Do the whole, this is a confidential conversation, and you do interviews with folks across the organization, and you ask questions like we talked about earlier, but also questions like, how would you describe senior leadership, right? What words would you describe? What if you could have your ideal state? What does that look like? And so you agree with senior leadership what these questions are. You have, these folks like us, external consultants, coaches, go in, they do all this interview, they do this analysis, they put together the report, they present it to the senior team, and then you together look for areas that you can begin to make some immediate changes and start building some positivity.
Hmm. Hmm. So, as someone starts to do this, well, I mean, what does that look like in practice when you're bringing other coaches in to help you through this process? Do you bring one in? Do you bring a team in? How does that work?
Yeah, well, it depends on the size of the organization. I mean, one of the things that we were talking about earlier is that I've seen a lot of times when you have a large organization, and in large organizations, what happens often is the department heads like their own, like they come in from X organization, they've worked with external coaches from that organization, so they bring in coaches they know and trust and has proven themselves. Yay! But what happens is over time you have, 20 coaching firms and, you know, another 50 individual coaches who aren't part of a firm, like operating in this organization. And it's a big, and so that's fun. In some ways, you get, you have variety, but what's the problem is that there's nobody manning the store, right? There's nobody really looking at all these things because it's paid for by the department, and HR hopefully is involved in people's strategy. But I get complaints all the time from HR that there's a lot of inconsistencies and lack of measurement and all kinds of craziness is happening. So they're throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars every year into good stuff, right? Into leadership development, organizational change. But they don't really know where the dollars are going, and they're not really measuring the change that they're investing in.
And so that's where having one coaching organization that's actually working as a team, as a cohesive team, can provide those types of reports, metrics, accountability.
Well, in some ways, there's two ways to do this, right? Like, we have definitely been brought in and said we've had organizations say literally, we want you to run all our coaching, right? And so when someone wants coaching, we do the assessment, like, is this even coaching the right use of funds, right? Like, you don't need coaching, you need to be fired, you know, or you don't need coaching, you need, some internal training program, right?
Yeah.
And so, so we were the gatekeepers along with HR. Like, I mean, they would either come to HR and HR send them us, or they would come to us and then we would loop in HR, right? So that's one model, right? And what was good about that is we were able to, we would standardize the entire thing, right? It was, one cost, analysis, one point of contact, one payment vendor. I mean, it was really easy for them. Everything was measured. They got reports. One of the biggest things that comes out of that is that we were able to collect data, still maintaining confidentiality from the coaching conversations, because that's the only way that works. There's got to be trust between the coach and the leader,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and report that back. But what I wanted to say is we've recently created an opportunity for companies that could bring us in to do everything I just said, but you don't even have to use us as your coaching source, or you can use us as one of your coaching sources. Because I don't want to tell, a $10 billion organization that you should only use us. I want you to use whoever you want, but let us do some quality control. Let us do some standardization. Let us be the person. If there's an issue, let us have to do, the running around and trying to figure out what the issue is, solving the issue, and let us make sure that every new coach that comes in is trained on your culture, your strategy, right? What your top priorities are. And so that they make sure that that goes into the coaching that they do.
Kind of like having a primary care physician managing your entire healthcare.
Yeah, exactly. Even a point of, it's right. You might like your primary physician, but then you also might like this physician for this and this physician for this. So even if
Yeah.
it's your primary, it's your health coach coordinator, right? Who's right. And some of these systems are doing this, which is awesome, where you have one point of contact and they're the one that's doing all of that. It's exactly right. And by the way, that's exactly what's wrong with our healthcare system, right? Is that you don't have
Yeah.
that. And the poor patient has no idea, and the left hand isn't talking to the right hand,
Yeah.
it's a mess. But that's exactly right. And that's a great analogy for what's happening in organization when it comes to coaching and training and all these external uses. You can see I'm passionate about it because I care deeply about organizations. I spend their money on us like I spend my money, right? Like very frugally. Like, don't spend money that's not giving you a good point of return. And so, whether it's us or anybody else, I really would encourage like HR leaders to, make sure that you have someone internal or external that manages all the back end stuff so that you can go online and quickly and immediately see, oh, this is what's happening in this engagement. Oh, this engagement ended 2 weeks ago. Why have we not gotten a report about how it went? That kind of thing.
That's so interesting because what you're describing is a much more methodical systematic process that's got accountability built into it, which is very different than a coach coming in to talk to a CEO about a few topics, and then you kind of like just keep going. And then that conversation is just pretty much intimately private between the CEO and the coach, and doesn't really permeate the entire company, because that's not how you change culture. You can't do it with one person, right?
There's an organization that I'm so thankful that we're in. I love the organization. The leaders are amazing. They have actually a really amazing culture. But I remember, when we did our first engagement, I was giving HR updates like, yeah, we don't, like, we're good. Like, once we assign you, we agree on like what you're going to be doing, deliverables, like you go, and I'm feeling like, no, but you should have oversight. Like you should know. So I find myself, like I just did this a couple weeks ago, I find myself, just give me an update, like I know
Mm.
you don't need this, but like, here's what's been going on, here's where we're at, that kind of thing. And listen, I get it. HR's got so much going on. That's why I say use, also if there's another, I don't know any other company that does this, but another company, just let them handle all that stuff. And so that you can have your monthly calls with your one point of contact who can say, listen, here's what's going great. And by the way, this coach over here is getting amazing, like, feedback from the manager, right? From
Mhm.
all the different managers, not the client, because client, they love the coach. So that's great. But are they
Mhm.
making a difference? Um, right?
Yeah.
Is their client
I mean,
changing?
that's probably one of the biggest distinctions between a coach that's likable and a coach that's actually having
Yeah.
an impact and making that ROI really shine.
I, I've told people maybe about 12 years ago, I had a client and I said, when when I was meeting them for the first time, and it was an in-person meeting, I know that he this client was so, it felt to him like going to the principal's office. Because before he got there, like when I was brought in, I said, and I joked earlier about why is this person not fired. I said, why is this person still here, right? And well, there's all this good stuff, but I said, well, they want a performance plan, like, no, okay, well, so but anyway, and so I was involved, and so when we wrote up the statement of work, he had like responded in a very negative way around a write-up that did. So bottom line is, I put in the statement of work a section that said, and he said all these things, and I said he needs to sign this statement of work, right? That basically where he knows that I know that you have been not a good person, right? And so I came in, and I mean, he was probably shaking, or maybe just in my head. Um, we ended up meeting for 2 hours. He realized I'm on your side. Like I'm here to make it work. This is
Yeah.
expensive service. Like they're not bringing me in because they don't want to succeed, but you got to change. And he did. He did great. We did an extension. Like he's still there. And this was what,
I mean,
12 years?
that's a perfect example of culture change, because it starts with people. It's the way people approach the job. It's, there's what's that phrase? Culture is what people say and do when you're not in the room. And
Yeah.
so that's the kind of thing that has to happen throughout an organization. We're not talking about tiny companies where there's 5, 10 people, which it's much easier to make a change. When you got an enterprise, there are a lot of moving parts. And so really having that coordination and multi-pronged approach, I think, is really important. As we close out here, how do you measure that you've actually made the impact in terms of culture that you intended to make?
Yeah. So first of all, it's like I say changing culture, one conversation at a time, right?
Mhm.
And then one symbol at a time, and then one email at a time, right?
Mhm.
And one like retreat at a time, where clarify values and mission and vision, and are you aligned? Um, so yes, and so as we come to close, so how do you measure it, right? So the first measure is, quite frankly, like what does the coachee say, right? Because you will read it, you won't. It's like necessary but not sufficient, right? So you need to know if this coach is not liked by people, like that's a problem, right? But there is that. Then one of the things that we do is that we ask the manager or the sponsor, right, to fill out another really simple feedback form, like what is their sense, and we ask them, what is your perceived return on investment of this engagement? Then ideally, if you were truly partnering with HR, what are the metrics that you are focused on right now? Is it, turnover/retention, right? Is that the metrics? Is it profitability? If we're working with sales teams, is it, top line growth? If we're working with, finance folks, like, is it like, cost control? Is it, good? And so what you do is you do some pre-post measures, and then you obviously look at what else is the organization doing to change these numbers, right? But then from that conversation, the conversation begins. What are you doing? What's your overall strategy? What are your priorities, right? What are you doing to change it? How are you measuring that, right? Some of it's really easy. Retention, it's already baked into the cake. And then let's talk about how coaching can support that. Then when we do the feedback surveys, let's make sure we have questions that address that very specifically. And then finally, you are doing pre and post measures. So, look, in coaching, in some ways, it's hard. How do you measure when a boss stops yelling at their team, right? I don't know what's the impact of that. Probably good, right? But it's hard to measure, right? So
Mhm.
some of those soft skills you're never going to be able to measure, but there are some hard data, things that you can absolutely measure, and I do suggest a very purposeful, strategic approach to that. And going back to what I said about HR, like HR should be receiving, depending on how much coaching is being done, quarterly, at least twice a year reports on here's what's happening, is here's the changes that folks have been seeing.
Think in such a competitive environment for good talent, retaining people is such a critical skill that every company should really strive for because people are not as replaceable by AI as some might make it seem, and they're definitely you want to keep the best people possible because the thinkers are really really hard to find in today's environment. So having the culture where they want to stay increases that retention. It's not only financially healthy for the company, it's great for morale and being able to recruit other people too. Um,
Uh,
Jeff, wonderful conversation. Thank you very much. What you had another point we want
Yeah,
to get?
just real quick. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Listen, before we sign off, can I take 2 seconds to introduce you to Bob, who's a leader who like lost his heart along the way, but then he
Let's
just
meet Bob.
right. So Bob, like he lost his heart, became arrogant under the pressures and stuff, and then he refound it. So Bob just wanted to say hi real quick. So say hi to Bob.
All right, there you go. Leading with Heart's mascot,
Exactly.
Bob.
All right.
Nice to see you, Bob, and thank you, Jeff.
All right.
We'll
Thank you, Rod.
see. We'll see all of you next time on Leadership Compass. Thanks for joining us.